This is the fifth MP3 unit for the Genesis module of the field-based SBS. It was recorded by Wilrens Hoornstra on the 23rd of February 2010. Its subject is Genesis and Science. Please listen to this MP3 or read its script first before you read the handout on Genesis and Science. This handout has two parts. The first part presents the most important views on Genesis and science among Christians and concludes with suggestions for further reading, in case you are interested and want to know more. The second part first attempts to formulate some basic facts and considerations. It then presents a number of relevant quotations from different sources. You may skip the second part, but please do read the first part. In many ways, the rise of modern science followed the Reformation. It was at this time that the Entzauberung, the disenchantment of the world, we spoke about in Genesis 1, began to unfold its full effect. If, as is stated in Proverbs 3, verse 19 and 20, the Lord founded the earth by wisdom, and by understanding established the heavens, and if by his knowledge the clouds drop down the dew, then it should in principle be possible to think God's thoughts after him and reconstruct the wisdom by which all these things work. It became common to think of two books of Revelation. The first was the Bible, which is quite literally a book, and the second was the book of nature, which also revealed God, but in a less direct and detailed way. Now, in principle, these two books should never contradict each other. After all truth is God's truth. But there is a famous quip which states, in theory, there is no difference between practice and theory. In practice, there is. Science, rightly exercised, and the biblical text, rightly interpreted, will not contradict each other. The problem, of course, is with those two conditions. In principle, there can be no conflict, but we all know about apparent tensions and conflicts between the Bible and the various sciences. How should we respond to them? We basically have four options. The first, the Bible has to submit to science. In other words, science is right. This approach assumes that scientific knowledge is the highest form of knowledge and truth and the most reliable, and it matches the skeptical reading that we have talked about. The second, science has to submit to the Bible. In other words, science is wrong. This matches the literalist reading. In practice, of course, it actually means that science has to submit to our interpretation of the Bible, which is not quite the same as the Bible itself. There is a subtle difference. Then the third option we have is scientists should limit themselves to scientific questions, and the interpretation of Scripture should stick with questions of theology and faith. Science and theology have their own sphere in which they have validity. There's some truth to this. Science and theology indeed work with different sets of questions. And as we have seen, science is concerned with cause and effect, with how something works or how it came to be. It is not concerned with purpose, at least not in an ultimate sense, or with meaning. Purpose and meaning are the realm of theology, faith, and revelation. A different way to put this is that science studies secondary causes, whereas the Bible deals with the primary or ultimate cause of everything. Primary and secondary causes are not at all mutually exclusive. Think of the line in the Lord's Prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread." Now, where does our bread come from? Most likely you bought it in the store. It was made from grain that grew on the field through photosynthesis and a host of other biological processes. and because the farmer sowed it, fertilized it, and harvested it. And yet we ask and thank God for bread. Yes, because these are all secondary causes, the rain and the sun and the farmer and the baker, but they do not cancel out God as the ultimate cause, the ultimate source, the ultimate giver of this bread. So there is a sense in which science and theology or biblical interpretation have their own domains, their own fields of inquiry. However, the problem with making this the solution when there is a conflict is that it splits reality into rather separate compartments. I once took part in a podium discussion with a theologian and a biologist on the issue of creation and evolution, and both the theologian and the biologist refused to make pronouncements encroaching on the other person's domain. The theologian would not say anything biological or scientific, and the biologist refrained from theological statements. I found this funny, but also unsatisfying. I was there as both a biologist and a theologian, so what was I to do? Develop a split personality? In the end, I am one person and live in one reality. I would like to know how the two sources of information, or perhaps better, the two sets of questions and answers, fit together. The fourth option, this is the solution I prefer, is we reconsider our conclusions. As far as the Bible is concerned, this means reconsidering not the Bible, but our interpretation of it. And perhaps we will have to live with certain tensions and open questions, at least for a while, but it is also possible that we can come up with a different reading or interpretation that makes sense of all the data. In the case of Genesis, two recent developments greatly help us to do just that. The first is an increasing awareness of and sensitivity to the importance of genre, to the finer distinctions and nuances in narrative as a type of literature. The second is the discovery of many ancient Near Eastern texts that help us to read Genesis as part of its own world. This enables us to recognize that what the real purpose of the text is. It is not to deal with questions of evolution or the age of the earth, but to present a correction to surrounding worldviews and beliefs in the form of anti-myth and antithesis. Now, this latter solution, reconsidering our interpretation of Scripture, is the one the Church has chosen in the past. For a long time, everyone believed that the earth was flat. In addition, the medieval worldview was geocentric. People believe that the Earth is the center of the universe and that the Sun rotates around the Earth. And this is certainly what the Bible seems to suggest, at least at first sight. It was a revolutionary, even heretical idea to suggest that the Earth is round, that you could end up in the East by traveling toward the West. Now, would anyone in his right mind really believe that? This is what Christopher Columbus sought to prove by sailing west. Didn't quite work out, but later it did work out. It was equally revolutionary to place the sun at the center and dethrone the earth. After all, Genesis 1 verse 1 suggests that the earth is the center of the universe. It was there before the sun. The Bible speaks of the ends of the earth and of its four corners. Psalm 104 verse 5, He set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved. So where do you get the idea? It's the earth that moves. The sun rises and it sets. Ecclesiastes 1 verse 5 says precisely that the sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. Now notice that we still use this kind of language today, knowing full well that a globe does not have corners or ends and that the sun does not actually rise. The reason that we today believe that the Earth is round and that the Earth is not the center of the universe or even just the center of the solar system is not because we have read this in the Bible. It is because the Church listened to science eventually and adjusted its reading of the Bible. The solution is accommodation. God's revelation is accommodated to what people can understand, to the way things appear in ordinary life, and to what was known at the time. With this understanding in mind, we are able to read the facts of Scripture, like Ecclesiastes 1 verse 5 or Genesis 1, differently. This dethronement of the Earth as the center has continued in the 20th century. As it turns out, there are billions of stars in our galaxy, and there is nothing very special about our star, the Sun. To be more precise, there are at least 100 billion stars in the Milky Way. And there are billions of galaxies besides ours, at least 100 billion, each with on average at least 100 billion stars as well. This adds up to a great many stars, a 1 followed by 22 zeros at least. It gives a whole new meaning to Psalm 8, very much a meditation on creation, when it says, "When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him?" But in fact, the size of the universe and the number of stars in it does not disturb us very much. It is two different questions that have greatly concerned evangelicals in the 20th century and continue to do so in the 21st century. That is, the age of the Earth and evolution. As for the first, evidence that the Earth is much older than everyone had originally thought was already accumulating decades before Darwin formulated his theory of evolution. It was widely accepted in the early 1800s. The Earth's crust is in some ways very much like a book. If one has learned the alphabet and the language, it is possible to read the various layers and reconstruct the history of a particular location. As it turns out, there is often lots of history to read about, since these layers can be up to several kilometers thick. Different from what is often claimed among Christians, these layers cannot have been deposited by a catastrophic worldwide flood some thousands of years ago. There is too much material, and these deposits are simply too regular and too consistent. They don't mix animals from different time periods and different ecological environments. You don't find human remains together with dinosaurs. Sediments were either deposited in seawater, in sweet water, that is, rivers or lakes or swamps, three rather different environments with different deposits, or on land. They always contain plant and animal fossils matching this particular environment. At times, these deposits were covered by volcanic eruptions, or they were exposed to erosion, folding, or a number of other processes. Each step in this process took time, lots of it. It is hard to imagine that science has been wrong on this score. Arguments for a young Earth that try to explain all this evidence away by and large failed to convince anyone except those committed to a literal reading of Genesis. Even more controversial is the question of evolution. Although it is interesting to notice that at the turn of the 20th century, many evangelicals had actually made peace with Darwin's theory. They had come up with different explanations as to how this theory could be harmonized with Genesis. This is what the handout is about. There was of course resistance to the idea of evolution, but this did not become much of a force or a movement until the 1960s. The rise of young Earth creationism, as the movement is known today, began in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ellen White, founding prophet of the movement, had seen a vision of the week of creation as a week like every other week, and had taught that the flood had caused the fossil record. One of her followers, George Macready Price, set out to vindicate her views by developing what is really a pseudoscience of flood geology as an alternative to mainline geology with its huge time spans. Flood geology tries to explain the deposits in terms of a worldwide cataclysmic flood. It was not until the 1950s that some evangelicals began to seriously pick up this idea. In 1961, an engineer and an evangelical theologian, Morris and Whitcomb, published The Genesis Flood, leaning heavily on the ideas of Macready Price. The book became a bestseller and effectively launched young Earth creationism as a movement among evangelicals, with such success that many evangelicals today cannot imagine any other view to be biblically acceptable. But what if evolution would turn out to be true? Would this destroy our faith or the reliability of the Bible? By no means. The Christian faith is robust. It can handle any discovery. There is nothing to be afraid of. It would be a serious problem for a literalist reading of Genesis, but we have already seen that this is not the only way we can read Genesis. The theory of evolution deals entirely with secondary causes, whereas Genesis 1 deals with primary or ultimate causation. In these terms, there is no conflict. I don't mean to say that it does not raise any questions or difficulties. It does. And there are answers to those questions. In the context of this presentation, I only want to briefly pick up one such question, that of death. Doesn't Scripture teach that death only began with Adam's sin? Well, it depends on what kind of death. I have already argued that Adam was not immortal and then was changed into a mortal being. What entered the world with sin was not physical death, much less mortality, but spiritual death, separation from God. After all, God had said, "In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." Genesis 2, verse 17. So, did Adam die in the day that he ate of it? Well, certainly not literally or physically. It is not biological death that began with the fall, but spiritual death. When we look in the New Testament, you find quite a few references to death that have to refer to spiritual, not physical or biological death, because the persons considered dead were physically and biologically very much alive. For instance, Colossians 2 verse 13, "And you who were dead in your trespasses, God made alive." It is beyond the scope of this lecture to deal with evolution in more detail. For this, the literature recommended in the handout should be helpful, especially Dennis Alexander, Creation or Evolution, Do We Have to Choose? And Francis Collins, The Language of God. At this point, I simply want to argue that we should be more relaxed about evolution. Genesis does not teach non-evolution. It can be read in such a way that the supposed conflict between science and the Bible evaporates. Creation and evolution are not opposites and they are not mutually exclusive. The validity and truth of evolutionary theory is therefore to be established by scientific research, not by an interpretation of Genesis 1, which seeks to answer very different questions. Now, we've come to the end of this unit. Please take some time to read at least the first part of the handout. I hope that it will help you, together with the literature and the websites that it suggests, to live between Genesis and science, which is not the same as between a rock and a hard place, and to develop your own understanding of these difficult but fascinating issues.